Ryan Cross had seen some questionable job postings in his 15 years as a freelance engineer, but high pay, moderate difficulty, full discretion required usually meant someone's fusion reactor was held together with prayer and electrical tape. He took the contract anyway because his bank account had started sending him passive-aggressive notifications, and Salvage Station Arcturus 7 wasn't the worst place he'd been summoned to. It wasn't the best either. The station hung at the edge of charted space like a rust-colored tumor, its docking arrays cluttered with ships in various states of dismemberment, and as Ryan's shuttle approached, he counted at least 9 vessels that were definitely beyond saving and probably haunted. Kes met him at the airlock, a woman whose face suggested she'd stopped finding anything amusing sometime around the station's construction. She looked at Ryan's tool case, then at Ryan, then back at the tool case with an expression that said she'd already written his obituary. "You're the 19th, she said without preamble, leading him through corridors that smelled like recycled air and broken dreams. 17 technicians, 1 AI specialist who left crying, and 1 guy who just stopped responding to comms after day 2. We found him in a maintenance shaft, completely fine. Just said he needed to think about his life choices." Ryan adjusted his tool case to his other shoulder. "Well, that's not ominous at all. What exactly am I fixing?" Kes didn't answer immediately, which was answer number 1 in Ryan's internal catalog of bad signs. They passed through sections of the station where the lighting flickered in rhythms that suggested the electrical systems had developed opinions, and Ryan noticed that several blast doors had been welded shut from the outside. "You ever hear of the Elrian Civil War?" Kes finally asked. "The one that turned 3 star systems into expensive debris fields? That was 8 years ago." "Yeah, well, we've got a survivor." They reached docking cradle 13, and Kes activated the observation port. Ryan looked out and felt his mouth go dry. The ship floating in the cradle was massive, easily 400 meters from bow to stern, its hull composed of some dark alloy that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The design was elegant in a way that human engineering had never quite managed, all flowing curves and asymmetrical beauty, like someone had convinced physics to try poetry. No running lights, no engine glow, no sign of active systems, just a dead warship that looked like it had been beautiful once. "That's the Nightfall's Edge," Kes said, "flagship of the Elrian Queen's personal fleet. Showed up here 8 years ago on emergency thrusters, core completely silent, and it's been a very expensive paperweight ever since." Ryan pressed closer to the observation port. He could see scoring along the hull where energy weapons had struck, sections that had been repaired with materials that didn't quite match. "Why not scrap it?" "Because the Queen won't leave." Kes's expression suggested this was a problem she'd grown weary of explaining. "She's been sitting in that dead ship for 8 years waiting for someone who can wake it up. The Elrian government in exile pays the docking fees and keeps sending specialists, and every single one of them fails." She turned to look at Ryan directly. "The ship's not broken, Cross. That's what they all figure out eventually. It's traumatized." Ryan had worked on plenty of ships with AI systems, had even coaxed a few stubborn navigation computers back to functionality. But he'd never heard anyone use that particular word. Ships don't get traumatized. This one did. You want the job or not? The pay was ridiculous, the kind of money that would solve several of Ryan's immediate problems and create a few new interesting ones. He looked at the Nightfall's Edge floating in its cradle, dark and silent and waiting, and felt something stir in his chest that might have been professional curiosity or might have been stupidity. In his experience, the two were closely related. "Show me the engine room," he said. The interior of the Nightfall's Edge was colder than Ryan expected, and the emergency lighting cast everything in shades of red that made the corridors look like arteries. His footsteps echoed strangely, like the ship was listening. Kes led him deeper into the vessel, past crew quarters that still held personal effects, past command stations where holographic displays flickered with ghost images. Everything was preserved perfectly, just waiting for someone to come back and resume living. The engine room was a cathedral of silent machinery, the quantum core rising 3 stories in the center like an altar to physics. And sitting on the floor beside it, cross-legged and perfectly still, was the Queen. She didn't look up when they entered. Her skin had a faint blue luminescence in the red emergency lighting, and her golden hair was braided in patterns so complex they looked like equations. Her ears swept back in long, elegant points that caught the light strangely. She wore something between a uniform and ceremonial armor, dark fabric with subtle iridescence, and she was staring at the quantum core like it might speak if she waited long enough. Kes cleared her throat. "Your Majesty, this is Ryan Cross. He's the 19th, the Queen said without turning. Her voice was lower than Ryan expected, with an accent that turned certain syllables into music. You can leave us, Station Master Kess. Kess left quickly, the airlock hissing shut behind her with uncomfortable finality. Ryan stood there with his tool case, acutely aware that he was alone with alien royalty in a dead ship, and that his plan had extended roughly as far as show up and wing it. The Queen finally looked at him, amber eyes reflecting the emergency lights. Can you hear it? She asked. Ryan listened. The engine room was silent except for the faint hum of life support in his own breathing. He had no idea what she meant, but something about her stillness, the way she sat there like she'd been waiting for centuries, made him terrified to disappoint her. Yes, he lied and watched something shift in her expression that might have been hope or might have been resignation. She gestured to the quantum core. Then show me. Ryan set his tool case down beside the quantum core and tried to look like he knew what he was doing. The core itself was beautiful in a way that made his engineering degree feel inadequate. A cylinder of what looked like contained starlight, wrapped in crystalline lattices that pulsed with faint, irregular rhythms. He'd worked on quantum drives before, but nothing like this. This was art pretending to be machinery, or maybe the other way around. So, he said, pulling out his diagnostic scanner, how exactly does one break a sentient ship? Valora rose from her sitting position with a grace that suggested gravity was more of a suggestion than a rule. She moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could see the subtle patterns of bioluminescence beneath her skin, like constellations mapping unknown territories. The Nightfall's Edge isn't just a ship. It's a living system, a machine intelligence that evolved over 6 centuries of flight. My family's bloodline has been bonded to it for 43 generations. She placed her hand on the core housing, and for a moment Ryan thought he saw the light inside pulse in response. During the war's final battle, we lost everything. 12 warships, 30,000 people, all gone in 4 hours. The core was connected to every ship in the fleet through quantum entanglement. It felt them die. Ryan's scanner beeped unhelpfully, displaying readings that made no sense. And then it just stopped working. It retreated. Valora's hand fell away from the core, deep into its own architecture, into places I can't follow. Every technician your people sent tried to force it awake. Resets, neural reprogramming, even threatening to dismantle it piece by piece. Her voice carried an edge that suggested she'd had strong opinions about that last option. But you can't threaten something that's already lost everything it loved. It just hides deeper. Ryan looked at the core, at its irregular pulsing, and felt something click in his mind. It's not broken, he said slowly. It's afraid. Valora's amber eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his nervous system reconsider several life choices. Yes, she said simply. So Ryan did something that probably violated multiple engineering protocols. He sat down on the floor, cross-legged, facing the quantum core like it was a person he was trying to have a conversation with. Valora watched him with an expression he couldn't quite read. What are you doing? Introducing myself, Ryan said, feeling only moderately insane. If it's hiding, maybe it just needs to know someone's here who isn't going to hurt it. He pulled up the core's access interface on his handheld terminal and started sorting through the outer layers of its architecture. The code was gorgeous and incomprehensible. Quantum algorithms that shifted and reformed like living things. Hi, he said to the core, feeling absolutely ridiculous. I'm Ryan. I fix things. Well, sometimes I fix things. Sometimes I make them worse, but in interesting ways. I once accidentally convinced a navigation computer that it was a coffee maker, so, I've got range. Valora made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been a cough. He couldn't tell. This is your professional approach? My professional approach got fired from 3 stations in 2 years, Ryan said, diving deeper into the core's architecture. So we're trying the deeply unprofessional approach instead. The code grew more complex the further in he went, layers upon layers of defensive structures that the core had built around itself, beautiful and terrifying, mathematical poetry written in fear. Tell me about the last battle, he said to Valora. Not the strategic stuff. What do you remember? She was quiet for long enough that Ryan thought she might not answer. Then she sat down beside him, mirroring his position on the cold engine room floor, and her presence was warm enough that he could feel it through his jacket. I remember that we were winning, she said softly. For about 20 minutes, we were actually winning. Then their reinforcements came through the jump point, and everything was fire. Her hands were clasped in her lap, knuckles pale. The Nightfall's edge was screaming. I've never told anyone that. It made sounds through the hull that weren't mechanical, weren't anything except grief. When the other ships died, it felt every one of them go silent. Ryan found himself talking, which was dangerous because his mouth had a habit of operating independently from his brain. I had a dog when I was 8, he said, still working through the core's defensive layers. He got hit by a transport shuttle, and I just sat with him for 3 hours until he died because I didn't know what else to do. Couldn't fix it, couldn't stop it, just had to be there. He glanced at Valora. Sometimes the worst thing isn't dying. It's being the one who survives and has to remember. Something shifted in the core's readings, a tiny fluctuation that his scanner almost missed. Valora saw it too, her breath catching. It heard you, she whispered. They worked through the ship's night cycle, which Valora's 2 remaining attendants enforced by dimming the emergency lighting and bringing food that Ryan barely touched. The attendants were both stern-faced Elrian women who looked at Ryan like he was a stain on their queen's dignity, and they spoke to Valora in their own language, words that sounded like water running over stones. Valora answered them patiently, but never took her eyes off the core for long. Ryan talked to the core about everything and nothing, about the stations he'd worked on, the ships he'd barely saved, the catastrophic mistakes he'd made that somehow turned into solutions. He made terrible jokes about quantum mechanics and got a smile from Valora when he described a drive core as spicy physics. He found himself telling the core about his sister, who died in a mining accident when he was 19, and how he'd spent 5 years afterward taking the most dangerous jobs he could find because existing hurt more than risking his life. The thing about trauma, he said to the core, to Valora, to himself, is that you can't logic your way out of it. You just have to sit with it until it gets tired of screaming. Valora brought him something to drink, a sweet liquid that tasted like starlight. Might if starlight had flavor, and their fingers brushed during the handoff. She didn't pull away immediately, and Ryan's exhausted brain noted this as potentially significant before filing it under deal with later. You should rest, she said. In a minute, Ryan lied, already pulling up another layer of the core's architecture. He was so deep now that the code looked less like programming and more like memory, fragments of sensation and experience translated into mathematics. He could see the echo of the battle here, compressed into quantum foam, and it was beautiful and terrible, and no wonder the core had run away from it. Sometime after midnight station time, Ryan fell asleep sitting up, his terminal still active in his lap, and woke a few hours later to find someone had covered him with a cloak that smelled like ozone and distant flowers. Valora was back in her spot across the engine room, watching the core, but when she noticed he was awake, something soft crossed her face. You snore, she said. The core found it amusing. Its quantum fluctuations stabilized for 20 minutes. Ryan laughed, because what else could you do when alien royalty told you that your snoring comforted a traumatized spaceship? Well, he said, at least I'm good for something. Day 2 became day 3, became day 4, and Ryan stopped leaving the engine room except to use the facilities and immediately regretted because the Elrian plumbing systems had opinions about human biology. He survived on stimulant patches that Valora's attendants provided with increasing disapproval, and the sweet rations that tasted different every time he ate them, like the ship was experimenting with his taste buds. His hands shook from too much caffeine and not enough sleep, but every time he considered stopping, the core would pulse in a way that felt like a question, and he'd dive back into its architecture for another few hours. The defensive structures the core had built were masterpieces of terrified genius, fractal patterns that repeated infinitely inward, each layer more complex than the last, mathematical labyrinths designed to lose anyone who came looking. Ryan stopped trying to break through them and started building bridges instead, tiny pathways of trust written in code that said, I'm not here to hurt you, in every language he knew. He narrated everything he did, talking to the core like it was a skittish animal he was trying to coax out of hiding. Okay, so here's my theory, he said on the third night, his voice hoarse from overuse. You're not actually broken. You're just really committed to this whole hiding thing. Which fair. I once hid in a cargo bay for 6 hours to avoid a conversation about my feelings, so I get it. But the thing is, eventually you run out of places to hide, and then you're just sitting in a cargo bay at 3 a.m, wondering why you're like this. Valora had started sitting with him during these sessions, close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed. She'd given up trying to maintain regal distance somewhere around hour 30, and now she just sat cross-legged on the floor like a person instead of a monarch. Her armor discarded in favor of a simple dark tunic that made her look younger. Tell me about your people, she said quietly while Ryan worked. I've been in exile for 8 years. I've forgotten what it's like to just talk about ordinary things. So Ryan told her about Earth, about the orbital stations where he'd grown up, about his mother who'd been a stellar cartographer and his father who'd sold secondhand ship parts and had a laugh that could fill a room. He told her about learning to fix engines in his father's shop, about the first time he'd successfully repaired a quantum drive and felt like he'd touched something divine. Valora listened with an attention that was almost uncomfortable, like she was memorizing every word. What about you? Ryan asked, carefully constructing another pathway through the Corps' defenses. What was your life like before the war? Valora was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she said, I was 19 when it started. I just finished my education in quantum mechanics and ceremonial dance, which is as ridiculous a combination as it sounds. A smile ghosted across her face. I was supposed to have decades to learn how to be queen. Instead, I got 4 years of watching my people tear themselves apart over philosophical differences that seemed very important until the shooting started. She drew her knees up to her chest, and the gesture was so human it made Ryan's heart hurt. Now I'm 33, my fleet is gone, my legitimacy is questioned by half the Elrian factions, and I've spent 8 years sitting in a dead ship because it's the only thing I have left that still feels real. Ryan made a joke about how at least she had great real estate and was rewarded when Valora actually laughed, a sound that echoed through the engine room and made the Corps' readings spike. Her attendants, who'd been standing near the entrance, looked genuinely scandalized. One of them said something sharp in Elrian that made Valora's smile disappear. What did she say? Ryan asked. Valora's expression had gone carefully neutral. That it's inappropriate for me to laugh with a human, that I'm forgetting my position. She stood up in one fluid motion, and suddenly she was every inch a queen again, radiating authority that made the temperature in the room seem to drop. She spoke to her attendants in Elrian, her voice carrying an edge that needed no translation, and both women bowed and left quickly. When she sat back down, closer this time, her shoulder pressed against Ryan's, there was something defiant in the gesture. I've spent 8 years being appropriate, she said. It hasn't brought my ship back. That night, Ryan finally broke through to the Corps' innermost layer, and what he found there made him stop breathing. Not code, not architecture, but pure memory rendered in quantum state. The battle played out in his neural interface with perfect sensory detail, and he experienced it the way the Corps had experienced it. 12 ships dying simultaneously, their quantum signatures winking out like stars going supernova, and the Corps feeling every single death as if it were its own. Thousands of voices screaming through entangled particles, and then silence so absolute it felt like the universe had ended. Ryan pulled out of the interface, gasping, tears streaming down his face, his hands shaking so badly he dropped his terminal. Valora caught it before it hit the floor, then caught him, her hands on his shoulders, her face close to his. What did you see? Everything, Ryan managed. I saw everything it saw. Valora, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry this happened to you. She pulled him against her, and for a moment she wasn't a queen, and he wasn't a technician. They were just two people who'd touched the same grief and survived it. Her hand cupped the back of his head, and he could feel her heart racing. Or maybe that was his. Can you help it? She whispered against his hair. Ryan pulled back enough to look at the core, at its irregular pulsing, at the mathematical poetry of its trauma. He placed his hand on the housing, feeling the faint vibration beneath his palm, and spoke directly to the intelligence hiding inside. Hey, he said softly, I know you're scared. I know you've seen things that nothing should have to see. But Valora's still here. She's been waiting for you for 8 years, sitting in the dark because she won't leave you behind. And I think maybe it's time to stop hiding, because the people who loved you, the ones you lost, they wouldn't want you to spend forever running from their memory. He pressed his forehead against the core housing. Come back, please. It's safe now. I promise it's safe. The core pulsed once, twice, and then something shifted deep in its quantum architecture, like a door opening after being locked for a lifetime. The nightfall's edge woke up like a star being born, and Ryan was dimly aware that he might have screamed a little bit, which was embarrassing but also completely justified, given that the entire ship had just decided to resume consciousness at 4 a.m. station time. Light flooded every corridor simultaneously. Not the blood-red emergency lighting, but the ship's natural bioluminescence, cascading through the walls in waves of blue and silver that looked like the ocean had learned to glow. The gravity systems engaged with a hum that Ryan felt in his bones, adjusting from the station's artificial pull to something smoother, more organic. The quantum core blazed with azure brilliance, and Ryan was on his knees in front of it, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking from 4 days of stimulants and not enough food, and the sheer overwhelming relief of having actually fixed something for once in his disaster of a career. The core sang. That was the only word for it. A sound that wasn't quite audible, wasn't quite physical, resonating through quantum states and Ryan's neural interface, and possibly his soul. A greeting that felt like coming home after being lost for years. Except the greeting wasn't directed at Valora, who'd stood up so fast she'd actually stumbled. The greeting was for Ryan, specifically and unmistakably, the core's consciousness reaching out to wrap around his presence, like a child finding their parent in a crowded room. "Oh no," Ryan said, because his brain was cycling through the implications at roughly light speed, and none of them were good. "Oh no, 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 that's not supposed to happen." Valora's attendants burst into the engine room, followed shortly by what seemed like every remaining crew member the Queen had, all of them talking over each other in rapid Alrian, while diagnostic holographs bloomed in the air. Valora stood frozen, staring at the core, at Ryan, at the core again, and her expression was doing something complicated that Ryan's exhausted brain couldn't parse. One of the attendants, the stern one whose name Ryan thought was Thyra, started shouting commands, and people scattered to various stations throughout the engine room. Ryan tried to stand up and discovered his legs had opinions about the last 4 days that mostly involved not cooperating. He made it about halfway to vertical before Valora was there, catching him with surprising strength, her hands warm through his jacket. "Easy," she said, and her voice had gone soft in a way he'd never heard before. "You need to rest." "I need to figure out why your ship just imprinted on me like a baby duck," Ryan said, leaning against her more than he probably should. "That's bad, right?" "That seems bad." Thera appeared beside them, her face carved from disapproval, holding a data tablet that was scrolling through information faster than Ryan could track. She spoke to Valora in Elrian, short clipped sentences that got increasingly agitated, and Valora's expression went from complicated to carefully blank. "What?" Ryan asked. "What's wrong?" Valora guided him to sit on a supply crate, because his legs had given up entirely on the whole standing project. She knelt in front of him, which seemed wrong. Queens shouldn't kneel, but before he could protest, she took his hands in hers. Her palms were warm and slightly luminescent, and he could see his own reflection in her amber eyes. "The core acknowledges my authority," she said carefully. "It knows I'm queen, it accepts my right to command, but it will only obey you." Ryan's brain, running on fumes and spite, tried to process this. "That doesn't make sense. I didn't do anything except talk to it and accidentally show it my childhood trauma. That's not exactly bonding protocol." "You're the first person who treated it like it was still alive," Valora said. "Everyone else approached it as a malfunctioning system to be repaired or reset. You sat with it in its grief. You shared your own." Her hands tightened on his. "Machine intelligences don't forget that kind of kindness, and quantum cores that have been traumatized tend to fixate on whatever made them feel safe again." Thera said something sharp, and Valora responded without looking away from Ryan, her tone carrying royal authority that made even Thyra step back. "She says this is unprecedented," Valora translated, "that we need to run full diagnostics, determine the extent of the bonding, find a way to transfer the core's loyalty back to me." She paused. "She's also suggested we might need to remove you from the ship entirely and attempt another reset." "I'm not doing that," Ryan and the core said simultaneously, which was deeply weird, and also explained why every crew member in the engine room had suddenly gone very quiet. Ryan could feel the core's consciousness at the edges of his mind now, not intrusive but present, like a cat that had decided his lap was the only acceptable place to sit. Valora's expression shifted into something that might have been relief, or might have been resignation, or might have been something else entirely. "Come with me," she said, helping him to his feet. She didn't let go of his hand, which Thyra clearly had opinions about based on her expression, and led him out of the engine room into corridors now blazing with light. The ship hummed around them, happy, and Ryan realized he could feel its contentment through whatever connection the core had established. It was pleased Valora was touching him. The ship had opinions about him holding the Queen's hand, and those opinions were overwhelmingly positive. "Your ship is a romantic," Ryan said, slightly delirious. "I've created a matchmaking quantum intelligence. This is how my career ends." Valora made a sound that might have been a laugh, and her hand tightened on his. They reached the bridge, and Ryan stopped breathing again because the viewports now showed the full glory of the starfield, and holographic displays bloomed across every surface, showing ship systems coming online, in cascading sequences. The quantum core's consciousness pulsed through it all, painting Valora's face in shifting colors, and she looked like something out of a myth, beautiful and terrible, and entirely too real. The senior staff were all there, running diagnostics, calling out system statuses, and they all stopped when Valora entered. She waved them back to work with a gesture and crossed to the captain's chair, but she didn't sit. Instead, she stood at the main viewport, looking out at the salvage station and the infinite dark beyond. And Ryan saw what he should have seen days ago. She was alone, queen of a scattered people, commander of a single restored ship, survivor of a war that had taken everything, and utterly, completely alone. "Valora," he started, but she turned before he could finish. "My people don't touch outsiders," she said, and every crew member on the bridge suddenly found their stations fascinating. "We have protocols about bloodlines and contact that stretch back 3,000 years. Physical touch between Elrians and other species is considered deeply intimate, something reserved for family or," she hesitated, "or those bound by more than politics." Ryan's sleep-deprived brain finally caught up. "You touched me, multiple times. You're holding my hand right now." "Yes," Valora said simply, and she crossed the bridge to stand directly in front of him, close enough that he had to tilt his head up slightly to meet her eyes. "I am." Ryan's brain, which had been operating on approximately 3 hours of sleep spread across 4 days, decided this was an excellent time to prioritize absolutely everything except processing what Valora had just implied. "So when you covered me with your cloak," he said, "that was a big deal." "Yes," Valora said, and she was still standing close enough that Ryan could count the subtle bioluminescent patterns beneath her skin if he'd been capable of counting anything. "And when you held my hand in the engine room?" "Yes. And just now, when you—" "Ryan," Valora interrupted gently, "I've been touching you inappropriately by my culture's standards for approximately 3 days, and every member of my crew has noticed, and we're going to have a conversation about it. But first you need to sleep before you fall over." Ryan opened his mouth to argue and discovered she was absolutely right. The bridge had started doing interesting, tilting things that bridges shouldn't do. Valora caught him again, which was becoming a habit, and said something in Elrian that sent her crew scattering. Thyra approached with a medical scanner, ran it over Ryan with visible disapproval, and reported something that made Valora's expression shift into what Ryan's fading consciousness recognized as anger. 4 days on stimulants with minimal food," Valora said, and her voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Thyra says your neural pathways are so overstimulated that you're approximately 2 hours from a complete system crash." "But the ship's fixed," Ryan managed, because priorities. "The ship is fixed, you're broken, and apparently I employ the most negligent engineer in 3-star systems." She slipped an arm around his waist, supporting most of his weight. "Thyra, prepare the consort's quarters." Every crew member on the bridge froze. Thyra said something in Elrian that sounded like a question and an objection simultaneously, and Valora's response was short and carried enough authority that Thyra actually bowed before leaving. "What's a consort's quarters?" Ryan asked, pretty sure he'd misheard. "Guest quarters was occupied by refugees, medical bay is being repaired, and my quarters have an actual bed," Valora said, navigating them toward the bridge exit. "Don't read into it." Ryan's brain, in its final moments of consciousness, absolutely read into it. He woke up 16 hours later in a bed that was obscenely comfortable and smelled like ozone and distant flowers, which his sleep-drunk mind identified as Valora's scent before he'd even opened his eyes. The room was dark except for soft, bioluminescent strips along the walls that pulsed in slow, calming rhythms. He sat up slowly, discovering someone had removed his boots and jacket, but left everything else, and there was a tray of food on the bedside table that was still warm. The quantum core's presence hummed at the edge of his consciousness, content and calm, like a cat purring in another room. The door opened, and Valora entered, carrying what looked like tea, stopping when she saw he was awake. She changed into something less formal, a simple dark robe that made her look softer, and her hair was loose around her shoulders instead of braided. "You're alive," she said. "Thyra was concerned you might sleep for 3 days. How long was I out?" 16 hours. I checked on you 4 times. The crew is now taking bets on whether I've lost my mind." She sat on the edge of the bed, which seemed significant, but Ryan's brain was still booting up. "Drink this. It'll help with the stimulant withdrawal." Ryan took the tea, and it tasted like starlight again, sweet and strange, and somehow exactly what he needed. "So," he said, because subtle had never been his strong suit, "we should probably talk about the thing." "Which thing?" "The ship bonding to you my culture's protocols about physical contact, or the fact that you're currently in my bed. All of those seem like important things. Valora smiled, and it was tired and real, and made her look her actual age instead of the ageless monarch she projected. The core has bonded to you completely. Thyra ran full diagnostics. It will accept commands from me, but only if you're present on the ship. If you leave, it will go dormant again within hours. She took the tea back from him, set it aside, and folded her hands in her lap. In Elrian political structure, there's a position that translates roughly as consort engineer. It's ancient, from before we had quantum cores, when ship intelligences were temperamental and needed constant care. The person who held the position had authority second only to the monarch, was granted full protection under royal law, and was considered, she paused, choosing words carefully, essential to the throne. Ryan's heart was doing complicated things. That sounds political. It is political. It's also personal. The position was historically filled by Elrian nobility who proved themselves indispensable to the ship and the crown. She looked at him directly. I'm asking you to stay, not just as crew, not just as the engineer, as someone who holds rank and protection and mine. The word hung in the air between them like a quantum state, both everything and nothing until observed. I'm human, Ryan said, because his brain had to point out the obvious. I'm from a salvage station background, I have no political training, and I once accidentally started a bar fight by insulting someone's ship design. You also spent 4 days sitting with a traumatized machine intelligence, talking to it like it mattered, sharing your grief because you understood its pain. Valora shifted closer, and Ryan could see the subtle glow beneath her skin intensifying. You brought my ship back, Ryan. You brought hope back. And when you held my hand in the engine room, when you let me touch you despite knowing it meant something in my culture, you didn't pull away. I didn't know it meant something, Ryan admitted. You do now. Valora's hand found his, that same warm grip, and the quantum core pulsed with approval through their connection. I'm offering you a position, yes, authority and protection, and a role in reclaiming what my people lost. But I'm also asking if you want to stay because... She hesitated, and vulnerability cracked through her royal composure. Because I've been alone in the dark for 8 years, and you're the first person who made me remember what it's like to not be afraid all the time. Ryan looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the 19-year-old who'd been thrust into war, the queen who'd lost everything, the woman who'd waited 8 years beside a dying ship because hope was all she had left. The core hummed in his mind, content and safe, and he realized it wasn't just the ship that had bonded to him. What if I mess this up, he asked. What if I'm terrible at politics and accidentally insult someone important and ruin everything? Valora's smile was soft and sad and knowing. Then you'll be exactly what I need. Someone real. Ryan's first instinct was to laugh, because his life had become so absurd that alien royalty was propositioning him in her bedroom, while a sentient spaceship approved via quantum telepathy. And if that wasn't the setup to a joke he'd tell in a bar, he didn't know what was. But Valora's expression didn't change, and her hand was still warm in his, and the core's presence in his mind pulsed with something that felt unmistakably like encouragement, the way a friend might nudge you towards someone at a party. Your ship is a terrible wingman, Ryan said, and was rewarded when Valora actually laughed, the sound filling her quarters and making the bioluminescent strips pulse brighter. It has excellent taste, she said, and her thumb traced small circles on his palm, a gesture so casually intimate it made his breath catch. So, will you stay? Will you be my consort engineer and help me reclaim a kingdom? Or will you go back to salvage stations and wonder what might have been? Ryan thought about the last 15 years, drifting from station to station, taking contracts that paid well but meant nothing, fixing ships for people who'd forget his name the moment he left. He thought about his sister, about the 5 years he'd spent after her death just existing because living hurt too much. And he thought about the last 4 days, sitting in the dark with a traumatized ship and a lonely queen, feeling like he'd finally done something that mattered. I should warn you, he said slowly, I'm going to be terrible at this. I don't know your protocols. I'll probably offend half your political allies within a week, and I have a documented history of making things worse in creative ways. Valora's smile turned mischievous. I'm offering you a kingdom in exile, a queen with more enemies than allies, and a ship that's traumatized enough to need therapy. If you wanted safe and easy, you should have stayed in the salvage business. When you put it that way, how can I refuse? Ryan squeezed her hand, and the gesture felt monumental, a choice that would reshape everything that came after. Yes, I'll stay. I'll be your consort engineer or whatever ridiculous title you want to give me, and I'll help you fix your kingdom the way I fixed your ship. Badly at first, probably, but with good intentions. Valora pulled him closer, closing the distance until they were barely a breath apart, and Ryan could see gold flecks in her amber eyes that caught the light like stars. The title grants you protection under royal law, she said softly. It means no one can harm you without facing me. It means you have authority to speak in my name, to make decisions for the ship and crew. It means... She hesitated, and her free hand came up to cup his jaw, her touch gentle and deliberate. It means you're mine, and I'm yours, and everyone will know it. That's terrifying, Ryan said honestly. Yes, Valora agreed and kissed him. It was soft and careful and tasted like starlight tea and possibility, and the quantum core sang in Ryan's mind with pure joy, its consciousness wrapping around them both like a blessing. When they pulled apart, Valora was smiling in a way that made her look young again, free of the weight she'd carried for 8 years. The crew is going to have opinions, she said. Thyra already looks like she wants to throw me out an airlock. Thyra will adjust, and if she doesn't, well, I'm the queen, and you're essential to my ship's functionality. She'll have to learn to live with it. Valora stood, pulling Ryan up with her, and he realized he felt steady for the first time in days. Come, we should make this official before I lose my nerve. The bridge was full when they arrived, the entire senior staff plus what looked like every crew member who could fit. And Ryan had the distinct impression that Thera had called an emergency meeting. Everyone fell silent when Valora entered, still holding Ryan's hand, and he felt approximately 300 years of Elrian protocol judging him simultaneously. Valora spoke in Elrian first, her voice carrying the authority of someone born to command, and whatever she said made half the crew look shocked and the other half look resigned. Then she switched to Common Standard, presumably for Ryan's benefit. The Nightfall's Edge has chosen Ryan Cross as its primary bond. This is unprecedented but not unwelcome. By the authority granted to me as Queen of the Elrian people in exile, I'm appointing him to the position of Consort Engineer, with all rights and protections that entails. Thyra stepped forward, her expression carefully neutral. Your Majesty, the crew has concerns. This human has no training in our customs, no understanding of our political situation. Granting him such authority is my decision, Valora interrupted gently but firmly. He brought our ship back from the dark, Thyra. He sat with its grief when everyone else tried to force it awake. If that doesn't prove his value, I don't know what would. He's human, someone else said from the back. And Ryan couldn't tell if that was meant as an insult or just an observation. So? Valora's hand tightened on Ryan's. He's also brave and kind and better at listening than most people I've met. Human doesn't mean lesser, and I won't hear that argument again. Ryan cleared his throat because apparently he was expected to say something. Look, I know this is weird. Trust me, from my perspective, it's also extremely weird. A week ago, I was taking repair contracts at a salvage station, and now I'm apparently Space Royalty's boyfriend and bonded to a sentient ship. But I'm here because I want to be, and because Valora asked, and because... He looked at the Corps' readouts on the bridge displays, feeling its contentment through their connection. Because sometimes the most broken things just need someone willing to sit with them in the dark until they're ready to be fixed. The crew was quiet for a long moment. Then one of the younger engineers, an Elrian with scars across his temple, stepped forward and bowed. Welcome, Consort Cross. The engine room could use someone who actually talks to the ship instead of just programming it. Others followed, some enthusiastic, some clearly reserving judgment. But Thera was the last. She approached Ryan directly, studied him with an intensity that made him want to apologize for existing, then bowed shallowly. If my queen trusts you, I'll accept her judgment. But if you hurt her or this ship, human protocols about violence won't protect you from me. That's fair, Ryan said, because it absolutely was. Valora addressed the crew again, outlining their next moves now that the ship was functional. They leave salvage station Arcturus 7 within 2 days, make contact with the scattered Elrian factions, begin the long work of rebuilding what the war had destroyed. It was ambitious and probably impossible, and exactly the kind of project Ryan had spent his career avoiding, because caring about outcomes meant risking failure. But when Valora looked at him while she spoke, when the quantum core hummed its approval, when he realized he'd somehow stumbled into becoming essential to something larger than himself, Ryan discovered he didn't mind the risk anymore. Later, after the crew had dispersed and they were alone on the bridge, Valora pulled him close again. Thank you, she whispered against his shoulder. For staying. For choosing this. Ryan wrapped his arms around her, feeling the warmth of her skin through her robe, the quantum core singing contentment, and thought about how he'd spent 8 years drifting because existing hurt less than living. Thank you for asking, he said, for seeing something worth keeping. Outside the viewports, the stars blazed in infinite configurations, and the Nightfall's edge prepared to fly again after 8 years of silence, carrying a queen who'd never stopped hoping and an engineer who'd finally found something worth fixing that wasn't just machinery. The quantum core pulsed with joy, bonded to both of them now, no longer hiding in the dark because someone had finally convinced it that coming home was worth the risk. And Ryan, standing on a restored warship with an alien queen in his arms and a sentient ship in his head, realized he'd accidentally become exactly the person his 19-year-old self had needed after his sister died. Someone who knew that broken things could be beautiful, that grief didn't have to be the end of the story, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was sit with someone in the dark until you both found the light again.